Grief had already taken everything worth taking. Then my sister called at 6 in the morning, her voice too calm to be frightened and too urgent to be innocent. "Do not come home today," she said. By noon, I knew I was being lied to. By evening, I understood the lie was never about keeping me safe. She had not come back to mourn our parents. She came back to steal everything else. My name is Alyssa Prescott. I am 34 years old, and for the last 4 months, my life has been a carefully choreographed exercise in survival. The winter ferry accident that took my parents did not just leave a gaping hole in our family. It left an entire historic seaside inn in Newport, Rhode Island, resting squarely on my shoulders. Their deaths were sudden, violent, and utterly disorienting. In the aftermath, I became a ghost haunting my own life. Outwardly, I maintained a mask of total composure. I greeted the longtime patrons, managed the grieving housekeeping staff, and nodded through endless, hollow condolences from the local business community. Inwardly, I was running on nothing but dark roast coffee, an avalanche of legal paperwork, and sheer, unrelenting stubbornness. Keeping the inn afloat was a full-time job on its own, but I was also working my regular career simultaneously. I handled remote compliance audits for the Blackwell Compliance Group, a rather demanding risk management firm. My days were a grueling marathon split down the middle. I would spend the morning checking guests into rooms that smelled of sea salt and old cedar, and my afternoons were spent hunting for regulatory discrepancies and financial anomalies in corporate spreadsheets, hunched over my laptop behind the antique oak front desk. I was exhausted to my very bones. Then there was my older sister, Brooke Mercer. Brooke had been a phantom in our family dynamics for years. She had built a life far away in Texas and surfaced only during the major holidays. Armed always with beautifully polished excuses and a unique talent for sounding incredibly affectionate over the phone without ever actually being present in the room. There was always a delayed flight, a sudden business emergency, or a vague health scare that kept her from coming home. But the funeral changed her pattern. Instead of making a brief, tearful appearance and catching the first flight back to Dallas, Brooke announced she was extending her stay. "I am staying to help," she told me on the day we buried them. Her voice was thick with a sorrow that looked absolutely flawless from the outside. "I cannot leave you to handle all of this by yourself. We are family. We have to stick together now." She moved her designer luggage into the inn's third-floor suite, the largest and most luxurious room on the property, and suddenly began acting like the fiercely devoted daughter she had never managed to be when our parents were actually alive. At first, a small, desperate part of me wanted to believe that grief had profoundly changed her. Death does strange things to the human heart, and I hoped the profound shock of the accident had snapped her back into the reality of our family. I wanted a sister. I wanted someone to share the unbearable weight of the mourning process, but the comforting illusion of sisterly bonding did not last long. The questions started softly in the second week, slipping into casual conversations over morning coffee or late-night glasses of wine. They were not the soft, meandering questions of a grieving daughter looking to preserve fond memories. They were sharp, calculated, and oddly specific. She cornered me in the commercial kitchen one morning while I was preparing the breakfast service. "Alyssa," Brooke began, leaning casually against the cold stainless steel counter, "have you had a chance to look over the vendor contracts yet? The ones for the linens and the daily food service." "They are on a standard auto-renew," I replied, too tired to look up from the tray of pastries I was organizing. "And the liquor permits," she pressed, taking a slow sip of her tea. "Are those tied to Dad directly, or are they registered to the limited liability company?" I frowned, finally pausing my work to meet her eyes. "They are under the holding company. Why do you ask?" "I am just trying to get a handle on the exposure," she said smoothly, offering a sympathetic smile. "We need to know where we stand. Oh, by the way, what exactly is kept in that locked archive room behind the old front desk, the one with the heavy deadbolt?" It was a highly specific detail to notice. The average guest, or even a visiting family member, would never pay attention to that door. But the archive room held decades of private financial ledgers, complex tax returns, and the original, irreplaceable deed to the valuable bluff the inn sat upon. She began to circle back to the same subject, again and again, like a predator testing the structural integrity of a fence. The core of her obsession always came down to one specific theme. "Do you have formal control yet?" she asked me late one evening, staring into the roaring fire in the main parlor. "I mean, legally speaking. Has the probate court cleared enough for you to be the sole operating signatory?" "The estate lawyers are working through the filings," I told her, keeping my voice carefully neutral despite the sudden spike in my pulse. "Does anyone else besides you know where the original operating papers are stored?" she asked. Her eyes remained fixed on the dancing flames rather than looking at me. "Just in case something happens to you. We need to be smart about protecting the assets." I told her they were safe, but I did not tell her where they were. My instincts, honed by years of sniffing out corporate fraud and hidden agendas at Blackwell, were beginning to scream at me. The definitive shift, the exact moment my grief-blurred discomfort hardened into a sharp and focused dread, happened in the middle of the night. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning. I could not sleep. My mind was spinning with impending compliance deadlines and the inn's dwindling payroll account. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and walked to the second-floor window overlooking the side courtyard, hoping the cold sea air seeping through the old glass would calm my racing thoughts. Down below, a shadow detached itself from the side of the building and moved deliberately across the frosted grass. It was Brooke. She was wearing a heavy wool coat over her pajamas. She was not wandering aimlessly in the grip of insomnia or grief. She moved with clear, tactical purpose. I watched in absolute silence as she walked the entire perimeter of the property. She stopped at the side utility entrance, raised her smartphone, and took a flash photograph of the electrical and water meters. Then she moved down the line of exterior doors, stopping at each one. She was counting them. Even from the second floor, I could see the slight movement of her breath in the freezing air as she mouthed the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. She paused at the heavy delivery entrance, running her bare hand over the solid brass deadbolt, visually testing the old metal keyhole. Then she walked to the staff entrance, staring intently at the modern digital keypad lock. She was actively categorizing the access points. She was studying which doors required physical, old-fashioned keys, and which ones could be easily bypassed with a numerical passcode. I stood completely frozen by the window, the winter chill seeping through the glass and straight into my chest, freezing the last remnants of my naive hope. The part that unsettled me the most was not her sudden curiosity about the business. Innocent curiosity is inherently disorganized. It asks questions randomly, out of confusion or genuine interest, but Brooke was not curious. Brooke was prepared. She was mapping the vulnerabilities of my parents' estate with cold precision. It was terrifying how prepared she seemed to ask the exact right questions about legal control, ownership records, and physical security before anyone had even offered her any answers. She was not acting like a sister trying to hold on to her family. She was acting like a hostile entity preparing for a corporate takeover. And as I watched her slip back into the shadows of the inn, I knew my mourning period was over. The morning sun hitting the antique mahogany reception desk did nothing to warm the profound chill that had settled into my bones. While I spent my days mechanically surviving the aftermath of the funeral, my sister spent hers putting on a masterclass in public mourning. To the outside world, Brooke was the absolute picture of a devastated but resilient daughter desperately trying to hold her shattered family together. Her performance was terrifying precisely because of its flawless execution. I watched her from the back office as she intercepted Maria, our head housekeeper who had worked for our family for 20 years. Brooke wrapped her arms around the older woman, her face buried in Maria's shoulder, murmuring soft words of comfort. A few minutes later, Brooke was in the main parlor, serving complimentary afternoon sherry to a retired couple from Boston. I heard her voice drift through the hallway, cracking with the exact right amount of delicate sorrow. "We are just taking it one day at a time," Brooke told the guests, pressing her hand against her chest. "Alyssa and I are getting through it together. That is the only way we can survive this. It is what our parents would have wanted." The couple looked at her with such profound sympathy that I had to look away to keep from shouting. The moment the heavy oak door to our private family quarters clicked shut, the fragile, grieving daughter vanished completely. The manufactured warmth evaporated from her eyes, replaced instantly by the sharp, calculating gaze of a corporate liquidator. The shift gave me emotional whiplash every single time. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, leaned against the granite kitchen island, and immediately launched into an interrogation. "Who currently has authorization on the payroll processor?" she asked, her tone entirely devoid of the softness she had used in the parlor. "Is it just you? Or does the outside accounting firm still have dual access?" I kept my eyes fixed on the sink as I scrubbed a cast iron skillet. "It is just me," I replied evenly, refusing to give her anything more. Brooke hummed a low note of disapproval. "We need to look at the insurance riders as well." I reviewed the summary pages. The umbrella policy for the property seems recklessly light considering the sheer liability of that oceanfront bluff. Speaking of the bluff, have you given any serious thought to how we might monetize that parcel? It is just sitting there, completely underutilized. I stopped scrubbing and stared at the soapy water. Monetize. She did not say preserve. She did not say maintain. She used a word meant for extracting value before an exit. I did not have time to dwell on her specific choice of vocabulary because the external phone calls began later that same afternoon. I was sitting at the front desk, trying to reconcile the weekly linen invoices, when Marcus Vance called my direct line. Marcus was a prominent commercial real estate broker in Newport. He offered his obligatory condolences regarding the accident before casually mentioning the incredibly productive phone call he had just finished with my sister. He told me they had spoken for nearly 45 minutes regarding the estate's long-term options. My blood turned to ice. The probate process was nowhere near completion. The legal ink on the death certificates felt as though it was barely dry. I found Brooke in the library later that evening and confronted her. I kept my voice low so the remaining staff would not hear the fracture in our family. "You are calling local brokers?" I asked, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. Brooke did not flinch. She simply closed the book she was pretending to read and sighed loudly. "Alyssa, please try to see the bigger picture here," she said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "I am only being practical. You are drowning in laundry schedules and your remote compliance audits. You are too emotional and far too overworked right now to think like a rational business owner. Someone has to look out for our future." Her sudden, overwhelming concern for our financial future felt entirely like a preliminary eviction notice. The psychological warfare escalated the very next morning over breakfast. I was standing at the stove scrambling eggs, the silence in the kitchen thick and suffocating. Brooke was scrolling through her phone, taking small bites of dry toast. Without warning, she launched her next strategic test. "You know, about 4 years ago, a boutique development firm out of New York made Dad an offer for the bluff," she said casually, as if remarking on the weather. "It was a massive number, something well into the 8-figure range, easily." She put her phone down and studied my profile. I could feel her eyes dissecting my reaction, searching for a flicker of desperation, a sign of weakness, or an admission that the inn was running out of operational cash. "He never mentioned it to me," I said, keeping my face entirely blank as I plated the food. "He loved that view of the water. He would never sell that land." Brooke offered a tight, utterly humorless smile. "People sell absolutely everything when the price is right. Sweetie, you just have to know their breaking point." After that calculated breakfast conversation, the atmosphere inside the historic building shifted from a state of tense mourning into a zone of active, silent hostility. The danger was not in what Brooke said aloud anymore. It was in what she did when she assumed I was occupied with my corporate job. I began noticing the tiny, creeping intrusions scattered throughout the property. A drawer behind the reception desk, the specific one holding the emergency blank checks, was left cracked open by half an inch. The heavy cardboard document boxes stored in the utility closet had been shifted slightly to the left, disturbing a thick layer of dust on the wooden shelf. The small brass key to the secondary file cabinet was hanging on the third hook instead of its designated second hook. She was hunting for something, moving through my parents' life like a thief trying to pick a complicated lock. The quiet, agonizing tension finally snapped on a Tuesday evening. I had just finished a brutal 4-hour review session for the Blackwell Compliance Group and walked downstairs to the private bookkeeping office to grab a fresh legal pad. The door to that office was supposed to remain locked at all times. As I approached, I noticed it was resting slightly ajar. I pushed the heavy door open without making a single sound. Brooke was sitting cross-legged on the floor. She had somehow bypassed the old mechanical lock on the bottom drawer of the cabinet. Spread out around her in a wide, chaotic semicircle were 5 years of my parents' confidential tax binders. The heavy leather spines were cracked open, exposing vulnerable pages of depreciation schedules, vendor accounts, and asset declarations. Brooke froze the instant she heard the old floorboard creak under my shoe. She scrambled clumsily to her feet, hastily kicking a manila folder under the heavy mahogany desk, and offered a high, nervous laugh that sounded exactly like shattering glass. "I was just looking for those old family photo albums," she said brightly, gesturing vaguely toward the entirely empty upper bookshelves. "The ones from our summer trips to Maine when we were kids." I felt so overwhelmingly nostalgic all of a sudden. I stood in the doorway and looked at her. I looked at the complicated, highly sensitive tax returns scattered aggressively across the Persian rug. I looked at the blatant, insulting lie standing right in front of me, wearing my sister's face. I said absolutely nothing in that moment. I did not scream, and I did not demand an explanation. I simply turned around and walked out of the room, gently pulling the heavy door shut behind me until the latch clicked. In that suffocating, heavy silence, a very distinct and irreversible line was crossed inside my chest. The heavy, blinding fog of my grief finally burned away completely, leaving behind a cold, intensely focused suspicion. My sister had not come back to help me mourn. She was meticulously preparing to erase me. The opportunity to look behind the curtain arrived by pure accident on a Thursday afternoon. Brooke had driven into town for what she called a brief networking lunch, leaving me alone at the property. Maria, our head housekeeper, came down to the reception desk carrying a bundle of discarded magazines and a heavy overnight express envelope. She explained that the parcel had been mistakenly mixed into the morning laundry collection taken from the third-floor suite. I took the envelope, intending to simply place it on Brooke's freshly made bed, so she would find it upon her return. I walked up the 2 flights of stairs, the heavy oak tread silent beneath my shoes. The suite smelled of expensive floral perfume and stale anxiety. I approached the small velvet sofa near the window to leave the parcel. As I smoothed the cushion, my hand brushed against something stiff, hidden completely out of sight. I paused. The thick fabric of the cushion was slightly elevated on the right side. I reached my fingers into the tight crevice and pulled out a second, identical express courier envelope. This one had already been torn open in a jagged, frantic line. My compliance training kicked in instantly. At Blackwell, we were taught that desperate people hide their most damaging truths in plain sight, usually shoved into dark corners when panic overrides logic. I pulled the documents out of the torn sleeve. The letterhead belonged to a high-powered corporate litigation firm based in Dallas, Texas. The subject line was printed in bold, unforgiving ink. It was a formal notice of default and a final demand for immediate payment. I read through the dense legal paragraphs, my eyes scanning the devastating financial architecture of my sister's secret life. The documents detailed the catastrophic collapse of a luxury wellness franchise Brooke had launched 3 years prior. The enterprise had not just failed, it had imploded violently. The attorneys were representing a private equity syndicate that had provided the initial operating capital. Brooke had signed ironclad personal guarantees to secure the funding. The grace period had completely evaporated. The lenders were invoking an acceleration clause, demanding the entire outstanding principal and accrued interest in a single, unnegotiable lump sum. I stared at the total amount due. It was written clearly at the bottom of the second page, $1,450,000. The sheer scale of the debt stole the breath right out of my lungs. That staggering number perfectly explained her sudden, fierce devotion to our grieving family. It explained the flawless performance in the parlor and the calculated questions in the kitchen. She was drowning, and the inn was a perfectly timed life raft. But as I turned to the final page, the narrative shifted from simple desperation to active, predatory malice. Tucked behind the formal demand letter were 3 pages of handwritten notes and a printed email thread between Brooke and a secondary, high-interest lending agency. The emails discussed securing temporary bridge financing to hold off the Dallas litigators. In the thread, Brooke explicitly offered up collateral that did not belong to her. She referred to unencumbered coastal hospitality assets in Rhode Island. She was trying to leverage the inn to save herself. The urgency of her actions suddenly made terrifying sense. The bridge lender had given her a deadline of exactly 30 days to produce a clear title and executive control over the property. She did not have time to wait for the probate courts to carefully process our parents' estate. She needed me to surrender administrative authority immediately. I carefully folded the documents, slid them back into the torn envelope, and shoved it deep beneath the velvet cushion exactly where she had hidden it. I walked back downstairs to the private bookkeeping office, locked the heavy mahogany door, and opened my laptop. My hands flew across the keyboard. As a risk auditor, navigating public civil registries was second nature to me. I accessed the county clerk databases for the greater Dallas metropolitan area and typed in my sister's legal name and her registered business entity. The search results populated instantly, confirming my darkest suspicions. The private equity demand letter was only the loudest alarm bell. Brooke was currently named as the primary defendant in 2 additional active civil claims. The first was filed by a commercial contractor suing for unpaid renovation invoices totaling $85,000. The second was a bitter lawsuit filed by her former business partner, alleging gross mismanagement of funds and breach of fiduciary duty. She was bleeding capital from every single artery, and the legal vultures were already circling the carcass of her luxury wellness brand. I clicked away from the court records and opened a new tab. I needed to know exactly when the timeline of her desperation intersected with the timeline of our tragedy. I logged into the airline loyalty portal we shared for family emergencies, a system I had used to book her a ticket home years ago and still had the administrative password saved for. I pulled up her recent flight history. The cold blue light of the screen illuminated a truth so fundamentally vile, it made my stomach physically turn. The winter ferry accident occurred on a Tuesday evening. The local authorities officially notified me early Wednesday morning. We held the memorial service the following Monday. Brooke's confirmation receipt showed she booked her first class, one-way ticket to Rhode Island on Wednesday afternoon. It was barely 8 hours after the police confirmed our parents' bodies had been recovered from the freezing water. She did not wait for the funeral arrangements to be finalized. She did not call me to ask how I was holding up or if I needed help choosing a casket. Her first instinct, within hours of learning she was an orphan, was to secure transportation to the primary asset. She moved on the financial opportunity long before she ever attempted to move on her grief. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, forcing myself to mentally replay every single conversation we had shared since she arrived. The pattern was glaringly obvious now. I searched my memory for one instance where she asked a genuine, emotionally vulnerable question. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that Brooke never asked what our parents' final moments might have been like. She never asked what music they wanted played at the service, or what charities they wished to support in their memory. She only asked what they left behind legally. She only cared about the vendor contracts, the insurance riders, and the signature authority on the checking accounts. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together, forming a horrifying picture. Brooke did not just want a quick payout from the estate. A standard liquidation would take months, possibly a full year, of tedious legal probate. Her creditors in Texas would absolutely not wait that long. She needed immediate, unquestioned control. She needed to drain the existing cash flow from the inn's operating accounts to satisfy her immediate legal fees. More importantly, She needed the deed to the oceanfront bluff. If she could legally position herself as the sole managing director of the holding company, she could instantly sign a highly lucrative option agreement with the New York developers she had mentioned at breakfast. She could sell the very ground our family legacy stood upon before I even had a chance to contest the transaction in court. I sat in the dim office for a very long time, listening to the distant crash of the winter waves against the shoreline outside the window. The heavy sadness that had weighed me down for 4 months evaporated entirely, leaving a sharp metallic clarity in its place. The woman sleeping on the 3rd floor was not my sister anymore. She was a bankrupt, desperate fraud. This was no longer a tragic story about family tension or unresolved sibling rivalry. It was an active, premeditated financial predation, wearing my sister's face and speaking with my sister's voice. And if she thought I was simply going to roll over and hand her the keys to our parents' entire life's work, she had vastly underestimated the daughter they actually raised. I left the inn at 8 o'clock the following morning under the completely plausible cover of an off-site compliance review. I made sure to complain loudly about the heavy traffic on the commute to Providence while pouring my morning coffee, knowing perfectly well that Brooke would be listening intently from the adjacent dining room. I drove in the exact opposite direction. I parked 3 blocks away from the imposing brick facade of Bell & Associates, checking my rearview mirror out of a newly birthed paranoia before walking into the law firm. Waiting for me in the private, soundproofed conference room were the 2 people who knew the financial architecture of my family better than anyone else alive. Naomi Bell was my parents' longtime attorney, a formidable woman with striking silver hair, sharp, analytical eyes, and a terrifying command of corporate estate law. Sitting beside her was Gideon Hart, a brilliant forensic accountant who had famously helped my father survive a vicious, highly coordinated hostile vendor lawsuit 15 years ago. I sat down at the heavy mahogany table, placed my leather briefcase carefully in front of me, and told them absolutely everything. I did not leave out a single detail. I told them about the midnight property inspections, the incredibly specific questions regarding vendor contracts, and the devastating $1 million demand letter tucked beneath the velvet sofa cushion on the 3rd floor. Naomi did not offer me empty sympathy or platitudes about family healing. She offered me a heavy leather-bound legal binder. "Your parents loved your sister," Naomi began, her voice steady and measured as she opened the thick binder and flattened the pages. "But love does not equate to blindness. They knew exactly who she was. Alyssa. And more importantly, they knew exactly what she was capable of doing if she ever found herself backed into a desperate financial corner." Naomi slid a dense, heavily notarized legal document across the polished wood. It was the master operating agreement for Prescott Harbor Holdings, the corporate entity that legally owned both the historic inn and the highly coveted multi-million-dollar oceanfront bluff. I had seen the standard executive summaries before, but Naomi turned to a heavily bookmarked section buried deep in the back pages. "This is a specialized bad faith conduct clause," Naomi explained, tapping the crisp paper with her gold pen. "Your father insisted I draft it and file it quietly 5 years ago. It stipulates that management authority can instantly shift under very specific, legally defined circumstances. If one sibling attempts fraud, coercion, or the unauthorized disposal of any business assets, the other sibling can immediately petition the court for emergency, sole operational control." I stared at the thick black ink on the page, completely stunned. The breath caught painfully in my throat as the sheer weight of the realization hit me. My parents had anticipated this exact nightmare. They had foreseen a dark future where Brooke returned home not to heal our family, but to harvest its wealth. They had secretly built an invisible legal fortress around the business, handing the protective keys to me from beyond the grave. "They protected you," Gideon said quietly, leaning forward and folding his hands professionally on the table. "But a legal clause is only effective if we secure the perimeter before she triggers a catastrophic financial event. Brooke is actively drowning, and drowning people thrash violently. We need to build a massive digital wall around your assets today, before the sun goes down." Gideon pulled out his own yellow legal pad, already filled with highly specific, bulleted action items. He did not speak in emotional terms. He spoke in the cold, hard language of corporate risk mitigation, which was exactly the language I desperately needed to hear right then. First, we execute immediate, sweeping digital safeguards, Gideon instructed, his tone indicating there was no room for debate. You are going to revoke every single old shared password associated with the inn. The property management software, the payroll processor, the utility portals, and the commercial insurance dashboards, everything gets locked down tight. We are going to establish mandatory dual authentication for any ownership-related filing or external vendor portal. I am also personally placing a high-level fraud alert on the corporate tax identification number. If anyone even attempts to run a soft credit check or secure a bridge loan against Prescott Harbor Holdings, my office will receive an automated alert within 10 seconds. I nodded firmly, the panicked fluttering in my chest finally beginning to slow, replaced by the methodical, highly trained rhythm of my own compliance background. I was no longer a grieving victim reacting to a familial crisis. I was a senior auditor managing a massive hostile security breach. What about the physical assets? I asked, my voice much stronger and far more resonant than it had been in days. The original deed to the bluff. The primary operating bank accounts. Naomi took over the conversation, sliding a thick stack of prepared legal affidavits toward me. I am filing emergency protective notices this morning with the primary commercial bank, your title insurer, and the state's registered corporate agent. We are aggressively creating a preemptive, undeniable paper trail. If Brooke tries to file forged management resolutions or attempts a rushed transfer of the property title using a mobile notary, these notices will automatically flag the transaction as highly disputed and freeze the entire process immediately. She handed me a heavy fountain pen. I also need you to sign these temporary management protections right now. They do not disinherit your sister outright, which is crucial because an outright disinheritance would immediately trigger a costly, years-long probate war in open court. Instead, they act as a heavy, invisible legal anchor. They make any emergency loan, rapid transfer of executive authority, or sudden real estate option agreement incredibly difficult and time-consuming to execute. We are systematically removing her ability to strike quickly. I signed my name repeatedly on the dotted lines, pressing the dark ink deeply into the heavy paper. Each individual signature felt like welding a solid steel bar to a cage I was quietly building around my treacherous sister. Should I confront her? I asked, looking back and forth between the two of them as I handed the pen back. Should I tell her I found the demand letter from the litigation firm in Dallas? Absolutely not, Naomi countered instantly, her eyes flashing with intense strategic warning. You say nothing. You go home and you play the exact role she expects you to play. You are the exhausted, grieving, completely overwhelmed younger sister. People driven by this level of immense, desperate greed all reveal their final, fatal mistakes when they firmly believe they are winning the game. Let her think she has the upper hand. Let her keep planning her grand theft, because every single illegal move she makes from this point forward will be meticulously documented by us and used to trigger the bad faith clause permanently. The strategy was brilliant in its psychological simplicity. Brooke was heavily relying on my emotional fragility. She was counting on my blinding grief to prevent me from seeing her financial maneuvering. If I shattered that illusion too early, she would simply retreat into the shadows, regroup with her attorneys, and find a more destructive, hidden way to attack the estate. I had to become the absolute perfect target. I left the law firm just before noon. The bright winter sun felt fundamentally different on my skin as I walked back to my parked car. For 4 agonizing months, my entire existence had been defined by a heavy, suffocating sorrow. I had been dragging myself through the long days, barely keeping my head above the crashing, violent waves of my parents' sudden absence. But as I drove back toward the historic property, gripping the cold leather steering wheel tightly, I realized the debilitating sorrow was entirely gone. The agonizing grief had been completely burned away by the sheer, breathtaking audacity of my sister's betrayal. In its place, Something entirely new and incredibly powerful had taken root deep inside my chest. I pulled into the crunching gravel driveway of the inn. I saw Brooke standing on the wraparound wooden porch, holding a steaming ceramic mug of tea. Looking out hungrily at the valuable oceanfront bluff she desperately wanted to sell to the highest bidder. She turned slowly and offered me a sad, entirely fabricated smile of sisterly solidarity as I stepped out of the car. I smiled right back at her. I infused my expression with all the tired, broken innocence I could possibly muster. I greeted her warmly, commenting on the bitter cold wind and complaining extensively about my tedious compliance meeting, offering her the exact narrative she needed to feel perfectly secure in her massive deception. For the first time since the winter ferry accident shattered my entire world, I felt something substantially stronger than mourning. I felt the cold, hard, and absolute steadiness of self-defense. Brooke thought she was playing a brilliant, high-stakes game of chess against a weak and defenseless opponent. She had absolutely no idea she had just walked directly into a meticulously designed, inescapable trap. The atmosphere inside the house shifted imperceptibly the moment Brooke realized my digital and physical barricades were firmly in place. She never said a word about being locked out of the vendor portals or finding the heavy iron deadbolt on the archive room suddenly impenetrable. Instead, she pivoted. She buried her frustration beneath a suffocating, almost theatrical display of domestic warmth and sisterly devotion. It was a terrifying performance to witness, precisely because it was so utterly convincing. I walked into the family quarters on a Wednesday evening and was immediately hit by the rich aroma of roasted garlic, rosemary, and searing meat. Brooke was standing at the vintage gas stove, wearing one of our mother's old linen aprons over her designer clothes. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing an elaborate pot roast, complete with glazed root vegetables and a freshly baked artisan loaf. The dining table was set with the good silver and heavy crystal wine glasses. "You look completely exhausted," she said, turning the heat down and wiping her hands on a towel. She poured a generous measure of a heavy, expensive Cabernet Sauvignon into a glass and pressed it directly into my hand. "Drink this. Sit down. I know how hard you have been pushing yourself with the Blackwell audits and the daily property management. I wanted to take at least one burden off your shoulders tonight." I took a slow sip of the wine, letting the dark fruit and oak mask the bitter taste of my own rising adrenaline. I thanked her, keeping my voice soft and deliberately weary. We sat down at the long wooden table. As she served the food, the true purpose of her elaborate domestic stage play quickly revealed itself. She was not trying to feed me. She was trying to build a schedule. "How is the rest of your week looking?" she asked casually, slicing into the roast. "Are you going to be chained to that computer at the front desk every single day? You really should take a break." "It is the end of the quarter," I replied, cutting a small piece of carrot. "The compliance reviews are piling up. I do not have much of a choice." Brooke took a delicate sip of her wine, her eyes studying my face over the rim of the crystal glass. "So, you will be here at the property all day tomorrow." I chewed my food slowly, recognizing the precise nature of the trap she was laying. She was probing for a blind spot. She needed a guaranteed window of time where the inn would be completely devoid of my presence. "Actually, no," I said, injecting a note of profound frustration into my tone. "Blackwell just threw a massive, full-day off-site review on my calendar for tomorrow. They are auditing a mid-sized logistics firm over in Providence. I have to go through their physical ledgers line by line." "Oh, that sounds perfectly awful," Brooke murmured sympathetically, though I caught the subtle, involuntary twitch of a muscle near her jaw. "What time do you have to leave?" "Early," I said. "Probably right around 6 in the morning to beat the commuter traffic over the bridge." She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the base of her wine glass. "And do you ever finish those off-site audits early? Might you come home unexpectedly in the middle of the afternoon?" "Never," I lied smoothly, meeting her gaze with absolute, manufactured sincerity. "It is a disaster over there. I will be locked in their conference room all day. Honestly, I probably will not be back here until late evening. 8 or 9 o'clock at the absolute earliest." The physical transformation in my sister was immediate and chilling. A heavy, invisible weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. The rigid tension in her spine dissolved. She visibly relaxed back into her upholstered dining chair, a tiny, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth before she carefully suppressed it. She had found her guaranteed window. "Well, that might actually be for the best," Brooke said smoothly, reaching for the bread basket. "I did not want to worry you while you were working, but I might have to bring in an emergency environmental crew tomorrow morning." I stopped with my fork halfway to my mouth. An environmental crew. Why, a guest checked out of room 4 this afternoon and complained about a strange, highly metallic smell coming through the vents in the west wing, she explained, her voice entirely devoid of panic. "It might be a small gas leak or a problem with the old boiler pipes. I am not taking any chances with liability right now. I am going to have inspectors come out and test the whole section. It will probably be loud and chaotic, so it is actually good timing that you will be out of the house." It was a masterful, seamless lie. I knew for an absolute fact there had been no guest in room 4. I had personally closed the entire west wing of the property for the winter season 3 weeks ago to save on heating costs. There was no smell, and there was no gas leak. There was only a carefully fabricated excuse to clear the building of any remaining staff or lingering guests while I was supposedly trapped in Providence. "Thank you for handling that," I said, forcing a grateful smile. "Just let me know what the inspectors say." We finished the dinner in a state of perfectly balanced, artificial harmony. I excused myself early, claiming exhaustion, and retreated to my bedroom on the second floor. I did not sleep. I sat in a heavy armchair near the window, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, staring at the digital clock on my nightstand. I waited until the house fell into absolute deafening silence. It was well past midnight, creeping toward 2 in the morning, when I finally heard the faint, distinct sound of the sliding glass door opening on the ground floor. I slipped out of my chair, my thick socks making zero sound on the hardwood floors. I crept down the back service stairs, a narrow, dark stairwell historically used by the kitchen staff to move between floors without disturbing the guests. The stairwell ended at a solid wooden door that opened directly onto the back stone terrace facing the ocean. I pressed my ear flat against the cold, painted wood. The freezing winter wind was howling off the water, but tucked into the sheltered alcove near the kitchen exhaust vents, I could clearly hear Brooke's voice. She was speaking in a sharp, urgent whisper into her mobile phone. She was not talking to a plumber or a local environmental inspector. "I do not care what his schedule is," Brooke hissed into the receiver. "You need to secure the courier windows for tomorrow morning. We have exactly 1 clean shot at this." I carefully slid my smartphone out of my pocket, opened the voice memo application, and tapped the red record button, holding the microphone close to the crack under the heavy door. "Yes, I have the mobile document witnesses booked," Brooke continued, her voice tight with aggressive impatience. "They will arrive right after she leaves the property. Just make absolutely certain we are getting all the signatures finalized before 5 o'clock. The moment the banks open on Friday, I need those authorized resolutions uploaded." There was a brief pause as the person on the other end spoke. Then, Brooke replied with a sentence that caused the blood to freeze solid in my veins. "Do not worry about the historical archives," she whispered sharply. "Make sure Curtis has the old ledgers ready to be swapped out the minute the crew clears the room. Yes, Curtis Vale. He knows exactly which boxes need to disappear before she gets back." The name hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had to press my hand hard against the heavy doorframe to keep my knees from buckling. Curtis Vale. He was not some anonymous corporate fixer or a shady real estate broker from Dallas. Curtis Vale was the inn's retired outside accountant. He was a man who had sat at our dinner table for Thanksgiving. He was a man who had helped me with my high school math homework. He had been one of my father's closest, most trusted confidants for over 20 years. If Curtis Vale was actively helping my sister coordinate this hostile takeover, then this was not a sudden crime of opportunity born from her recent bankruptcy. This scheme was significantly larger, vastly more complicated, and infinitely older than I had ever feared. Brooke was not just orchestrating a smash and grab to pay off her angry creditors. She was executing a highly coordinated, inside operation with the very man who knew where all our family's financial bodies were buried. I stopped the recording, my thumb trembling against the glass screen. The game had just escalated from a mere property dispute into an absolute war. The digital clock on my dashboard flipped to exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. The heater in my car was blasting high, fighting a losing battle against the bitter winter frost that clung to the edges of the windshield. I threw the gear shift into reverse, the tires crunching loudly over the frozen gravel of the inn's long driveway. My hands were gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned completely white. I was exactly halfway down the drive when my phone vibrated in the console. The Bluetooth connecting automatically to the car speakers. It was my sister. I hit the accept button on the steering wheel, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before I spoke. "Hello? Do not come home today," Brooke said. Her voice filled the quiet cabin of the car. It was entirely flat, stripped of all the warm, sisterly affection she had weaponized over dinner the night before. It was an urgent, metallic tone, far too calm to belong to someone who was genuinely frightened, and far too forcefully delivered to be innocent. "What is going on?" I asked, injecting a heavy dose of sleepy confusion into my response. I slowed the car to a crawl near the main stone gates. "There is a massive gas leak in the west wing," Brooke explained rapidly. The cadence of her words was flawlessly smooth, practically rehearsed. "The guest who complained yesterday was right. I called the emergency utility line 30 minutes ago. The city inspectors are here right now, and they have officially sealed the entire building. They told me the property will be completely unsafe until this evening at the earliest. They are bringing in massive industrial fans and tearing up the floorboards in the secondary utility closet." She paused, taking a sharp breath that sounded entirely performative. "I know you have that massive off-site audit in Providence today," she continued, her voice softening just a fraction, leaning into the trap I had built for her. "I just wanted to catch you before you got too far down the highway. Focus on your compliance review. Do not rush back here. Remember you said you would not be done until late tonight anyway. Stay in the city, get some dinner, and I will text you when the authorities give the all clear. I have everything completely under control." The explanation was beautifully constructed. It was violently convenient, completely unverifiable without walking into the building, and it perfectly isolated me from the property for the exact 12-hour window she desperately required. "Are you safe?" I asked, playing the role of the terrified, protective younger sister perfectly. "Do you need me to turn around and come back?" "No, absolutely not," Brooke insisted sharply, a brief flash of genuine panic bleeding through her polished facade at the thought of me returning. "The inspectors specifically said no unauthorized personnel on the grounds. Just go to work. I will handle the crisis." "Okay," I breathed out, letting my shoulders drop as if surrendering to the chaos. "Thank you for handling it. Call me if anything changes." I ended the call. The digital display on the dashboard returned to the navigation map. I pulled out onto the main coastal road, but I did not turn north toward Providence. I drove precisely 2 miles down the shoreline and turned into the empty, frozen parking lot of the municipal marina. I parked the car facing the dark, rolling waves of the Atlantic Ocean, left the engine idling to keep the heat running, and simply waited for the next shoe to drop. It did not take long. The silence in the car was shattered less than 45 minutes later. This time, the caller ID flashing on the screen did not display a name. It displayed a toll-free routing number belonging to the commercial fraud division of our primary banking institution. I answered the call immediately, my pulse suddenly hammering against my throat. "Good morning. Am I speaking with the primary authorized signatory for Prescott Harbor Holdings?" A sterile, heavily trained voice asked. "This is she," I confirmed, my eyes locked on a distant buoy bobbing violently in the gray water. "We are calling regarding an automated security hold placed on your master account 15 minutes ago," the representative stated plainly. "We received an expedited, Emergency Commercial Credit Draw Request. The total amount requested was $500,000, listing the primary real estate deed of your hospitality property as direct collateral. The stated purpose of the withdrawal was listed as emergency structural remediation. However, the request triggered a high-level block placed by your accounting firm yesterday afternoon. Could you please verify if you authorized this transaction? I absolutely did not authorize that transaction, I said, the words tasting like cold iron on my tongue. The request is entirely fraudulent. Please maintain the total security freeze on all associated accounts. Understood, the representative replied smoothly. The request has been officially voided and flagged for criminal review. Have a safe day. I dropped the phone into the passenger seat. Gideon Hart's digital wall had held firm. Brooke had tried to use her fake gas leak narrative to instantly leverage the inn for cash. Likely to satisfy the bridge lender waiting in Texas, she had failed. But my sister was a desperate woman fighting a ticking clock, and she was not relying on a single avenue of attack. Less than 10 minutes after the bank fraud unit disconnected, my phone rang for the third time. It was Naomi Bell. Your sister is incredibly aggressive. I will give her that, the attorney said by way of a greeting. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the static of the connection like a finely honed blade. My office just received an automated alert from the state corporate registry, followed immediately by a notification from our title insurance network. Someone just attempted to file revised management resolutions. What kind of resolutions? I asked, leaning forward against the steering wheel. The kind that would effectively erase you, Naomi replied grimly. They tried to file emergency paperwork naming Brooke as the sole acting manager of the holding company. The stated justification on the filing was your temporary incapacity. She submitted a sworn, notarized affidavit claiming you have suffered a severe psychological breakdown due to the trauma of your parents' passing, rendering you unfit to execute business decisions. A wave of pure, unadulterated nausea washed over me. She was actually trying to weaponize my grief. She was using the tragic, violent death of our parents as a legal loophole to paint me as an unstable, hysterical woman incapable of managing her own life. A mobile notary was booked to witness the signatures, Naomi continued, her tone dropping into a deadly, professional calm. And it appears the notary arrived at the property just after 6 a.m. They tried to push the paperwork through the automated state portal, assuming it would take days for a human clerk to review it. They did not realize we had already placed a contested freeze on the corporate registration. The filing was instantly rejected and locked. She cannot legally move the title, and she cannot assume executive control. So she is trapped, I said, a dark sense of satisfaction finally blooming in my chest. She is trapped, Naomi agreed. Stay exactly where you are. Let her keep bleeding herself dry. I thanked Naomi and ended the call. I leaned my head back against the leather headrest, closing my eyes. I had survived the morning ambush. The credit draw was dead. The management transfer was dead. Brooke had fired all her heavy artillery, and I had successfully absorbed every single blow without her even realizing she was hitting a reinforced concrete wall. But as the morning slowly bled into noon, the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle finally fell into place. My phone buzzed with a direct message from Gideon Hart. It was not a phone call. It was a secure, encrypted text message containing a single screenshot from the inn's internal server logs. I opened the image and zoomed in on the lines of code. Someone had tried to bypass the digital firewalls Gideon had installed on the archive network, but they were not searching for the deed to the bluff, and they were not looking for the current vendor contracts. The access logs showed a targeted, frantic search for files buried deep within a forgotten subdirectory. They were hunting for historical donor records and tax ledgers tied to our family's small charitable foundation. The records they were trying to access were specifically dated from 3 years ago. I stared at the screen, the bright light burning my retinas. The foundation was a tiny, localized charity my father had set up years ago to provide scholarships for marine biology students. It had absolutely nothing to do with the commercial value of the inn or the oceanfront bluff. It held barely any cash. It made absolutely zero logical sense for Brooke, a woman drowning in massive corporate debt, to waste precious minutes during her highly coordinated raid hunting for worthless charity ledgers. Unless the ledgers were not worthless, unless the ledgers contained something incredibly dangerous. I thought about the hushed, midnight conversation I had recorded on the terrace. I thought about Curtis Vale, our retired family accountant, specifically waiting to swap out the old physical boxes the moment the fake environmental crew cleared the room. By noon, sitting alone in my freezing car, I knew Brooke was not merely trying to secure control of the valuable real estate. By the time the winter sun began to dip low over the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the marina, I finally began to understand the terrible truth. The missing foundation records mattered vastly more to my sister than the multi-million-dollar property itself. The fake emergency, the attempted corporate takeover, the desperate rush for cash, it was all a massive, chaotic smokescreen. She had not returned home just to steal our future. She had returned home to permanently erase a crime she had committed in our past. I pulled my car out of the municipal marina exactly 45 minutes after noon and drove straight to the brick building housing Bell and Associates. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the morning ambush was shifting into a cold, razor-sharp focus. I walked into the same soundproofed conference room I had occupied the day before. Naomi and Gideon were already waiting, a chaotic spread of printed server logs, time-stamped digital access requests, and notary booking confirmations blanketing the heavy mahogany table. "Look at the timeline," Naomi instructed, handing me a highlighted sheet of paper. "It is a perfectly synchronized hostile takeover." Her objective was brilliantly simple. She used the fabricated gas emergency at 6 in the morning to physically remove you from the premises. The moment you drove away, she initiated the urgent management transfer with the state, immediately followed by the attempt to draw the secured line of credit. The final step would have been changing the physical keypad codes to lock you out entirely before you even realized you had been legally replaced. It was a smash and grab, Gideon added, pacing near the large window. But the property and the cash were only the loudest parts of the raid. I kept digging into the server access logs after I sent you that message this morning. Someone was actively crawling through the inn's network while the mobile notary was sitting in your driveway. They were completely ignoring the high-value commercial assets. They bypassed the deed records. They bypassed the vendor contracts. They went straight for the charitable foundation archives. Gideon pointed to a specific line of red text on the printed log. They spent 20 minutes trying to crack the encryption on the foundation ledgers from exactly 3 years ago. When the digital firewall blocked them, they clearly decided to switch to a physical extraction. I did not wait to hear another word. I left the law firm with Naomi's lead private investigator, a broad-shouldered ex-detective named Vance, following closely behind me in his own unmarked vehicle. I pushed my car well over the speed limit, my tires screaming as I took the sharp coastal curves back toward the inn. When we turned into the gravel driveway, there were no municipal city trucks in sight. There were no flashing hazard lights, no yellow caution tape, and no official environmental inspectors. Instead, there were 2 unmarked white cargo vans parked aggressively across the front lawn. 4 men wearing matching unmarked gray jumpsuits were hastily carrying heavy cardboard file boxes, physical server backup drives, and even framed historical office records out through the main double doors. They were not a remediation crew. They were a private demolition team hired to sanitize a crime scene. "Lock down the vans," I ordered Vance as I threw my car into park. "Nobody leaves with a single piece of paper." I stormed up the front steps and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The historic lobby was a scene of calculated destruction. I rounded the corner into the main front office and stopped dead in my tracks. Brooke was standing behind the antique oak desk. Sitting rigidly in the leather guest chairs were a terrified woman holding a notary stamp and Curtis Vale. The retired accountant looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen him, his pale skin slick with nervous sweat. "I am telling you, we have to finalize these emergency resolutions right now to save the family business," Brooke was insisting, her voice vibrating with a commanding, righteous authority. My sister is completely incapacitated, and the bank is threatening to call the loans. Just stamp the document. Put the pens down, I said. My voice was not a shout. It was a low, terrifyingly calm directive that cut through the chaotic energy of the room like a physical blade. Brooke turned around quickly. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. The inspector said the building was completely unsafe. The building is perfectly safe, I replied, stepping fully into the room as Vance moved to block the main exit behind me. The only toxic thing in this house is you. The signing is over. The credit draw is dead. The corporate registry has flagged your filings for criminal fraud. The mobile notary did not need to be told twice. She shoved her ink stamp into her canvas bag, muttered a frantic apology, and practically sprinted past Vance into the hallway. I ignored the sudden, sputtering attempts from my sister to formulate a new lie. My eyes swept over the office. The heavy iron deadbolt on the archive room door had been violently drilled out. Behind it, the primary filing cabinet was hanging wide open. Several drawers had been completely emptied, their contents likely sitting in the back of the white vans outside, but my gaze locked onto the main desk. Amidst the scattered legal affidavits, there was a glaring, empty rectangular space in the thick layer of dust near the heavy bronze lamp. It was the exact size of a physical accounting ledger. "Where is the foundation ledger from 3 years ago?" I demanded, looking directly at Curtis. Brooke opened her mouth to speak, attempting to maintain her posture of annoyed superiority, but it was Curtis who gave the game away. He did not look angry. He looked hunted. His hands began to shake so violently that his heavy gold watch rattled against the wooden armrest of the chair. He looked at the empty space on the desk, then looked at the door, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. That visceral reaction was the final, illuminating flash of lightning. My sister was staring at me with the furious resentment of a woman who had just lost a massive real estate grab, but Curtis was staring at me with the absolute terror of a man who was about to go to federal prison. The property grab was only half the job. The other half, the truly desperate half, was erasing whatever radioactive evidence was hidden inside that missing book. "Get out," I told them. "Both of you. Right now." She tried to stand her ground, raising her chin in a pathetic display of defiance, but Vance stepped forward, his hand resting heavily on his belt. The hired crew outside had already abandoned the boxes on the lawn and were speeding away in the white vans. Without a word, Curtis practically scrambled out of the room, leaving her to follow him in silent, humiliated defeat. By 7 o'clock that evening, the property was completely locked down. Naomi had secured a private security detail for the main gates, and Gideon had arrived with his specialized equipment to assess the digital damage. We sat in the dim light of the bookkeeping office, surrounded by the recovered boxes the fake crew had abandoned. The physical ledger was gone. Curtis had managed to slip it out in his briefcase during the chaos. But Gideon was a man who understood that digital ghosts never truly die. "Curtis is an old-school accountant," Gideon murmured, his fingers flying across his illuminated keyboard as he analyzed a dusty, outdated server drive he had pulled from the basement utility closet. He knew to destroy the physical book, and he knew to wipe the primary cloud backups, but he forgot about the redundant physical cache your father insisted on installing a decade ago. It backs up everything on the local network once a month and completely disconnects itself from the internet. Gideon hit the enter key with a satisfying click. A massive digital file populated on the large monitor. It was a complete, high-resolution scanned copy of the missing foundation ledger. I pulled my chair closer to the screen, tracing the columns of numbers with my index finger. The truth was buried in the third quarter of the fiscal year. Exactly 3 years prior, the foundation had supposedly authorized a series of massive, sequential grants to fund a holistic marine wellness initiative. The money was wired out over a period of 4 months. "Look at the receiving entity," Gideon said softly. I stared at the name of the vendor. It was a Shell Wellness event company registered in Dallas, Texas. The exact same corporate umbrella that had overseen the failed luxury franchise. She had not just made bad business decisions in Texas. 3 years earlier, she had systematically siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from our family's charitable foundation to prop up her failing lifestyle brand. She had stolen from the very scholarships our father had built to honor our community. And when her business collapsed anyway, leaving her with massive debt, she knew the inevitable estate audit after our parents died would immediately expose the theft. She did not come home to mourn. She did not even come home just to steal the inn. She came home to burn the evidence of her original crime before I could ever find it. The final pieces of the horrifying puzzle locked violently into place just after the sun completely set. The heavy darkness of the winter evening pressed against the frosted windows of the bookkeeping office, but inside, the harsh blue light of Gideon Hart's monitor illuminated a truth far colder than the ocean wind. Gideon spent the next 2 hours meticulously reconstructing the digital fragments of the recovered foundation ledger. He worked in absolute silence, his fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing the hidden transaction history with the public business filings he had pulled from the Texas State Registry. "I have the complete timeline," Gideon finally announced, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his exhausted eyes. The money did not just vanish, it was systematically extracted. Naomi and I leaned closer to the screen. Gideon pointed to a series of 4 massive wire transfers initiated exactly 3.5 years ago. She authorized 4 separate withdrawals from the charitable foundation over a period of 60 days, Gideon explained, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. The total amount extracted was $475,000. The receiving entity was listed as a holistic marine research initiative, but the routing numbers track directly back to a private holding company registered in Dallas. It is the exact same holding company Brooke used to launch her luxury wellness franchise. I stared at the staggering numbers on the screen. My sister had not simply made a series of poor investments that led to her current bankruptcy. She had built her entire glamorous life in Texas on a foundation of stolen charity money. She had taken funds meant for marine biology scholarships and used them to buy imported marble reception desks and designer yoga equipment for her doomed business venture. She likely expected to quietly repay the money once the franchise became wildly successful. When the business spectacularly failed instead, she buried the massive shortfall, stopped answering our phone calls, and stayed far away from Rhode Island to avoid the inevitable audit. "Your father knew," Naomi said quietly. I turned to look at the attorney. Naomi was not looking at the computer screen. She was reaching into her heavy leather briefcase. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. The flap was secured with a dark red wax seal, bearing the official crest of her law firm. "He came to my office exactly 26 months ago," Naomi continued, her voice softening with the weight of the memory. "He looked completely broken. He handed me this envelope and gave me extremely strict, legally binding instructions. I was to place it in our deepest escrow vault and leave it there indefinitely. I was only authorized to break the seal and present the contents if a severe, unresolvable dispute arose between you and your sister regarding the estate after his passing. Given the events of this morning, I believe we have aggressively crossed that threshold." Naomi slid a silver letter opener under the wax seal. The sharp tear of the thick paper sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. She unfolded a single page of heavy stationery, covered entirely in my father's familiar, elegant handwriting. She handed it directly to me. My hands trembled slightly as I held the letter. Reading his words felt like summoning a ghost into the room. He wrote with devastating clarity. He detailed the exact week he discovered the missing foundation funds during a routine end-of-year tax review. He described confronting Brooke over a secure phone line. He wrote that she wept hysterically, begging him not to report the massive discrepancy to the state authorities. She swore on her life that she was on the verge of securing private equity funding and promised to repay every single stolen dollar within 6 months. But my father was a pragmatic man. He wrote that he no longer trusted his eldest daughter around any business asset requiring financial restraint. He knew she was utterly compromised by her own bottomless ambition. I read the final paragraph 3 times, the tears I had refused to shed all day finally burning the corners of my eyes. I cannot expose her publicly, my father wrote, his pen pressing so deeply into the paper that the ink bled through the back. Your mother is currently recovering from her severe cardiac episodes. A public embezzlement scandal involving our eldest daughter, combined with the prospect of federal prison time, would absolutely destroy her fragile heart. I have to carry this burden in silence to keep your mother alive. But I will not leave Alyssa defenseless. I have instructed Naomi to completely revise the management documents and install the bad faith clauses. If Brooke ever returns to claim this property, Alyssa will have the sword she needs to cut her out completely. I carefully placed the letter on the desk, right over the empty rectangle of dust where the physical ledger had been sitting just hours before. The profound, agonizing weight of my father's silent sacrifice settled heavily onto my shoulders. He had lived the last years of his life carrying the toxic secret of his daughter's criminality, swallowing his own rigid moral code just to protect his sick wife from the lethal shock of the truth. And in that moment of devastating clarity, I finally understood the absolute truth behind the phone call I received at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. Brooke's frantic warning about a gas leak was never just a clever trick to keep me away from the property while she forged the management transfer. The real estate grab was entirely secondary. She was keeping me away from the inn so that Curtis Vale had the unguarded hours he desperately needed to locate and destroy the only physical records that could prove she had been stealing from the family long before the funeral. Curtis had likely helped my father quietly balance the books to hide the shortfall from the federal regulators years ago, which meant Brooke had the leverage to blackmail the retired accountant into helping her sanitize the crime scene today. The emotional wound landed infinitely deeper than the financial one. For 4 months, I had agonized over my sister's emotional distance. I had made endless excuses for her polished absences. I had genuinely believed she was a victim of a terrible economy, a desperate woman driven to do terrible things because she had lost everything in Dallas. I was completely wrong. Brooke did not become desperate after losing everything. She had been fundamentally dishonest first, and her current desperation was merely the inevitable symptom of her own greed. She had stolen from us while our parents were alive, and the very second they died in that freezing water, she saw an opportunity to permanently erase her sins and cash out the remaining equity. "We have everything we need," Naomi stated, breaking the heavy silence in the room. She gathered the printed server logs and placed them next to my father's letter. "We have the undeniable proof of the original foundation theft. We have the digital access logs proving the attempted cover-up today. We have the rejected fraudulent management filings. We can present all of this to the probate judge on Monday morning in a closed session. We can force her to sign a private settlement, strip her of any remaining inheritance, and quietly banish her from the state forever. We can handle this seamlessly, behind closed doors." I looked out the window. The ocean was completely black, a vast, churning void reflecting absolutely nothing. The grief that had anchored me to the floor for 4 months was entirely gone. The sorrow had been completely incinerated, leaving behind a cold, hardened core of absolute fury. My sister had subjected my father to years of silent agony. She had weaponized my mourning period, treating my tears as an operational advantage. She had looked me in the eye over a dinner she cooked in my mother's kitchen, smiled, and plotted to throw me out into the street. She wanted to handle her crimes in the dark. She wanted to use the cover of a fake environmental emergency to quietly erase her theft. She relied entirely on the assumption that we would always choose family privacy over public accountability. I turned back to the attorney. I felt entirely different inside my own skin. The terrified, exhausted woman who had driven away from the inn at dawn no longer existed. "No," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, unwavering authority that made both Gideon and Naomi pause. "We are not doing this in a closed session. We are not offering her a private settlement, and we are absolutely not letting her sign a quiet non-disclosure agreement." Naomi studied my face, her sharp eyes registering the fundamental shift in my posture. "Alyssa, a public filing will be brutal. The local press will undoubtedly pick it up. It will be ugly." "I want it to be ugly," I replied coldly. She stole scholarship money from children to buy luxury garbage in Texas. She blackmailed our family accountant. She tried to use a fraudulent claim of my mental instability to steal my home. She built her entire life on a foundation of lies, and she thinks she can just pack her bags and slip away into the shadows when she loses the game. I placed my hand firmly over my father's handwritten letter. Brooke wanted silence, I told them, locking my jaw. She wanted to destroy this family quietly. I am not going to give her silence. I want you to prepare the civil fraud claims. I want you to file the petition for the bad faith clause in open court. I want every single investor she defrauded in Texas to know exactly where she is. I want absolute, blinding exposure. We are going to burn her reputation to the ground, and we are going to do it with all the lights on. I did not authorize Naomi to drop the legal hammer the next morning. If you want to catch a predator, you do not scare them away. You leave the bait exactly where they expect to find it. Rather than filing everything at once and triggering an immediate, messy confrontation, I chose to let my sister believe she still had plenty of room to negotiate. I sent Brooke a highly ambiguous text message, stating only that we needed to figure out a path forward that worked for both of us regarding the estate. It was a calculated display of weakness, feeding her just enough rope to keep her talking. Brooke took the bait with astonishing speed. Convinced she could still bluff her way through the crisis, and confident that my supposed emotional fragility would prevent me from taking serious action, she went entirely on the offensive. She launched a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign among the inn's loyal staff and our oldest local business contacts. She was laying the psychological groundwork to justify my removal. Maria, our head housekeeper, came to me in tears on Tuesday afternoon. She confessed that Brooke had pulled the senior staff into the dining room to issue a grave warning about my declining mental state. Brooke told them I was completely unraveling under the pressure of the tragedy. She then systematically called our major vendors, from the commercial linen suppliers to the local artisan bakers, whispering that I was clinging dangerously to an inn I could no longer manage. She painted a tragic, compelling picture of a younger sister losing her grip on reality, positioning herself as the reluctant, responsible older sibling stepping in to save our parents' legacy from total financial ruin. I said absolutely nothing publicly. I did not defend myself to the staff, and I did not call the vendors to correct the record. I smiled, kept the business running smoothly, and let Brooke spin her elaborate web of lies. Every single falsehood she planted in the community was simply another brick in the wall I was quietly building around her. While Brooke was busy manipulating the local social circles, Naomi was aggressively preparing the real weapons. The attorney drafted a mountain of emergency filings, complex civil fraud claims, and a brutal legal petition to formally enforce the bad faith management clause written by my father. Simultaneously, Gideon Hart was dismantling the financial architecture of Brooke's inside operation. Gideon called me late on a Thursday afternoon with the final, damning piece of the puzzle regarding Curtis Vale. The retired accountant had not helped my sister out of some misplaced family loyalty, nor was he simply a victim of her blackmail. Gideon had subpoenaed the recent banking history of Curtis's private consulting firm and traced a series of highly obscured, massive cash payments. The money flowed through a blind intermediary account, but Gideon tracked the routing numbers directly back to a subsidiary of the exact same boutique development firm out of New York that Brooke had casually mentioned over breakfast. Curtis was not just helping my sister cover up her old theft. He was being paid a massive premium by the developers to ensure the bluff parcel changed hands as quickly as possible. The developer desperately wanted the land. Brooke desperately needed the quick cash to pay off her angry Texas creditors, and Curtis was the heavily compensated facilitator, making sure the historical foundation ledgers disappeared, so the real estate deal would not be frozen by a federal audit. By the end of the week, Brooke felt entirely secure in her position. She formally requested a family settlement meeting, demanding we sit down face-to-face to hash out a quiet, private transition of executive power. I agreed instantly. I told her to meet me at the law offices of Bell and Associates on Monday morning. When Brooke confidently walked into the soundproofed conference room, dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, Her triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She had fully expected to find me sitting alone, ready to surrender the keys to the kingdom. Instead, she found me sitting rigidly beside Naomi Bell and Gideon Hart, with a certified state court reporter actively setting up a stenograph machine at the end of the table. Brooke hesitated in the doorway, but her towering arrogance pushed her forward. She sat down directly across from us, adjusting her posture to project absolute, unbothered authority. "Alyssa, we really do not need an entire legal team and a court reporter for a simple family discussion," Brooke began, her tone dripping with heavily manufactured, patronizing concern. "I am just trying to protect you. You are completely falling apart. You know you cannot handle the operational stress of this property right now." "I am handling things just fine," I replied calmly, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "You are the one who attempted to authorize a $500,000 emergency credit draw against the property without my consent." Brooke waved her hand dismissively, falling spectacularly into the trap. "That was just a temporary measure to consolidate our position. I only needed temporary authority to keep my creditors from killing me in Texas. The franchise hit a rough patch, and the private equity guys are threatening to liquidate my personal assets. I was going to pay the estate back the moment the development option cleared on the bluff. It was a victimless, temporary loan to save my life. You are blowing a simple administrative maneuver completely out of proportion." I looked at the court reporter, whose fingers were flying silently across the keys. Brooke had just officially admitted on the public record that her attempt to seize control of the estate was entirely driven by her own personal debt, completely invalidating her sworn notary affidavit regarding my supposed mental incapacity. "And what about the historical archives?" Naomi asked, her voice dangerously soft as she leaned forward. "The ones Curtis Vale was attempting to physically remove from the property during your fabricated environmental crisis." Brooke did not even blink. Her ability to lie was almost pathological. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Curtis is an old man who was just organizing some dusty boxes for the transition. If something is missing from that room, it is because the inn is a disorganized disaster." Naomi did not argue. She simply opened a thick black binder and began dealing the documents across the polished mahogany table like playing cards. First, she laid down the time-stamped digital access logs, proving the coordinated, targeted attack on the inn's internal network. Next came the fabricated invoice from the fake environmental crew, which Gideon had directly tied to Brooke's personal credit card. Then, she placed the sworn statement from the mobile notary, confirming Brooke had lied about my presence on the property. Then came the firmly rejected credit draw application from the bank. Brooke stared at the papers. The color slowly drained from her face, her jaw tightening until the muscles fluttered, but she remained stubbornly silent. Then, Naomi delivered the fatal blow. She pulled out the restored digital scans of the foundation ledger from 3 years ago. She placed the documents right in front of my sister, heavily highlighting the specific fraudulent transfers to the Dallas Shell Company. "We have the digital scans," Naomi stated flatly, her eyes locking onto Brooke. "We know exactly what you stole from your father's charity years ago. We know exactly why you needed Curtis to destroy the physical book. And we know the developers were paying him heavily to help you steal the bluff to cover up the entire crime." I watched my sister's face carefully. I expected to see genuine panic. I expected tears, or perhaps a desperate, shattering plea for forgiveness, now that her entire life was laid bare. But Brooke was a narcissist entirely cornered by reality. Her eyes darkened, the polished, sisterly veneer completely cracking to reveal the raw, vicious entitlement beneath. Her entire story was collapsing in real time, the walls closing in from every side, but she simply refused to fold. Brooke stood up slowly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, deliberately ignoring the damning evidence scattered across the table. "You think a few scanned papers and a grumpy accountant are going to stop me?" she hissed, leaning over the table, her voice shaking with pure, unadulterated venom. "You have always been a pathetic, weak little girl hiding behind Mom and Dad. They are dead. Alyssa, you are completely alone. I will see you at the final probate hearing next month. I am going to stand up in open court, and I am going to prove to the judge that you are dangerously unstable, entirely controlling, and fundamentally unfit to run this family business. I am going to take every single thing you love." She turned on her heel and marched out of the conference room, slamming the heavy wooden door behind her. I did not flinch. Let her take it to court. She was betting everything on one last, desperate lie, bringing a knife to a gunfight while I was holding the absolute truth. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swung open at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning. I walked into the courtroom feeling entirely different from the shattered woman who had buried her parents just 4 months prior. I did not walk in carrying tissues or wearing the fragile posture of a grieving daughter. I walked in flanked by Naomi Bell and Gideon Hart, carrying thick leather binders filled with absolute, undeniable truth. Brooke arrived exactly 10 minutes later, and her entrance was nothing short of a theatrical masterpiece. She was dressed entirely in black, her clothes modest and slightly oversized to make her look smaller, more vulnerable. She wore zero makeup, allowing the dark circles under her eyes to be clearly visible under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. She looked like grief made flesh. She clutched a crumpled handkerchief in her trembling hands, leaning heavily on the arm of her expensive litigation attorney as they walked down the center aisle. When the probate judge took his seat behind the elevated bench, Brooke's attorney stood up and immediately launched into a breathtakingly fabricated narrative. He possessed a smooth, resonant voice, and he wielded it like a blunt instrument against my character. "Your Honor," the attorney began, gesturing sympathetically toward my sister. My client returned to Rhode Island simply to mourn the tragic, sudden loss of her beloved parents. Instead of finding comfort in her family, she found herself completely isolated and aggressively targeted by her younger sister. Alyssa manipulated all access to the historic inn. She weaponized legal technicalities to seize sole control of the estate, freezing my client out of her rightful inheritance. Alyssa has demonstrated a deeply concerning, emotionally unstable pattern of controlling behavior since the funerals, and we are petitioning the court to immediately install Brooke as the primary managing director to save the family business from total ruin. Brooke dabbed at her dry eyes with her handkerchief, offering the judge a look of profound, helpless sorrow. Naomi Bell did not sigh, and she did not roll her eyes. She stood up slowly, calmly buttoning her suit jacket, and approached the bench. She did not argue with the opposing counsel's emotional fiction. She simply began dismantling it, piece by terrifying piece. "Your Honor," Naomi said, her voice sharp and ringing with absolute authority, "the petitioner did not return home to mourn. She returned home to execute a highly coordinated, fraudulent transfer of executive authority to satisfy her massive personal debts in the state of Texas. And we brought the receipts." For the next 2 hours, Naomi presented a masterclass in legal destruction. She introduced the time-stamped internal server logs proving the targeted network attacks. She entered the fake environmental hazard invoice into evidence. She called the terrified mobile notary to the stand, who swore under oath that Brooke had booked her specifically for a fraudulent emergency management transfer at 6 in the morning. The representative from the commercial bank testified about the rejected $500,000 credit draw attempt. The judge's expression shifted rapidly from polite neutrality to a dark, furious scowl as he reviewed the mounting pile of undeniable evidence. Brooke's attorney frantically objected to the exhibits, but Naomi had laid the foundation flawlessly. The objections were overruled one after another. Then, Gideon Hart took the witness stand. The forensic accountant did not speak about family drama. He spoke the cold, unyielding language of numbers. I traced a series of unauthorized diversions from the family's charitable foundation dating back 3 years, Gideon testified, pointing to the enlarged digital scans of the recovered ledgers displayed on the courtroom monitor. The total amount extracted was $475,000. The funds were routed directly to a holding company completely controlled by Brooke Mercer. Furthermore, I traced recent, highly obscured consulting payments made to the estate's retired accountant, Curtis Vale, These payments originated from a subsidiary of a boutique real estate development firm in New York. The developer was paying Mr. Vale to help Brooke destroy the only remaining copies of the stolen foundation ledgers, paving the way for a rushed, heavily discounted sale of the estate's oceanfront bluff. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom. Brooke's attorney looked physically ill, staring at the financial diagrams Gideon had prepared. He had clearly been lied to by his own client regarding the depth of her exposure. But the final, devastating blow did not come from a bank record or a server log. It came from the grave. Naomi approached the bench one last time and requested to enter the sealed memorandum written by my father into the official court record. Brooke's attorney fought viciously to have it excluded as hearsay, but the judge, recognizing the signature and the notarized seal from 26 months prior, allowed it to be read. Naomi read my father's words aloud. She read about his heartbreaking discovery of the stolen charity money. She read about his agonizing decision to hide the crime to protect my mother's failing heart. She read his final but profound declaration that he had specifically revised the holding company's management documents to protect me because he knew his eldest daughter was entirely compromised by her own greed. The letter was not introduced as cheap melodrama. It was devastating, irrefutable context. It proved that my father had already seen enough of Brooke's toxic choices to build an invisible fortress around the family business long before he died. Brooke was forced to take the stand for cross-examination. Naomi circled her like a shark in bloody water. She pushed Brooke on the foundation theft, on the fake gas leak, on the developer bribes. Brooke maintained her fragile, weeping facade for 20 agonizing minutes, denying everything, claiming the ledgers were forged and the bank representatives were confused, but Naomi knew exactly where the pressure point was. She stopped asking about the money and started asking about the entitlement. "You did not just want to pay off your Texas creditors, did you?" Naomi asked quietly, standing very close to the witness box. "You wanted to sell the bluff. You wanted the entire estate. You felt you were owed it, despite abandoning this family for years." Brooke gripped the edges of the wooden witness box, her knuckles turning bone white. The carefully constructed mask of the grieving daughter finally cracked, shattering completely under the weight of her own monumental narcissism. She made the one fatal mistake I had been waiting for all morning. She stopped denying her intent and started fiercely justifying it. "I deserved it!" Brooke suddenly screamed, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings of the courtroom. Her eyes were wide, completely wild with genuine fury. "I deserved that money. Alyssa got everything. She got to stay here, playing the perfect little daughter, soaking up all their time and all their affection while I had to build a life from absolutely nothing in Texas. They gave her the best years of their lives. And what did I get? I got nothing. I had to take what was mine because they were never going to give it to me fairly." The entire courtroom froze. Even her own attorney buried his face in his hands. She had just confessed, in open court, on the official public record, that her actions were driven by a deep, festering resentment and a premeditated desire to take the assets by force. The judge did not need to deliberate. He struck his gavel with a sound like a cracking whip. His ruling was swift, brutal, and absolute. He immediately enforced the bad faith conduct clause written into the holding company's master agreement. He permanently stripped Brooke of any and all management authority, removed her completely from the estate's trust, and authorized my immediate sole operational control over Prescott Harbor Holdings. Furthermore, the judge announced he was formally referring the undeniable findings of the foundation embezzlement and the attempted corporate bank fraud to the federal prosecutor's office for further criminal action. Brooke was not just leaving empty-handed, she was leaving with a target on her back. I walked out of the heavy oak doors of the courthouse just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The cold winter air felt incredibly clean in my lungs. I stood on the granite steps and looked out at the city. I still had the historic inn. I still had the beautiful oceanfront bluff. I had successfully defended my parents' entire life's work, but the real victory I carried with me was far colder and significantly cleaner than any piece of real estate. As I watched Brooke storm down the sidewalk, her attorney refusing to walk beside her, The final, permanent truth settled deep into my bones. I finally understood that some people do not betray you in a single desperate moment. They do not suddenly lose their way. They rehearse their betrayal for years in the dark. They carefully map your vulnerabilities. They practice their lies in the mirror, and then they call you at 6 in the morning, hoping against hope that you are still naive enough to think they are family. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.